Very good, thank you.
It is happening.
So now back to our moderator, Shaul Bassi. He is Associate Professor of English and Post-Colonial Literature at Ca' Foscari University in Venice, as well as the co-founder and Italian president of Beit Venezia, a home for Jewish culture. He has written many, many articles and books, including Shakespeare's Italy and Italy Shakespeare, Place, Race, Politics. He established the International Literary Festival Incroci di Civiltà several years ago, and he coordinated the committee for the 500th anniversary of the Venice Ghetto. He was born and bred in Venice, a city like New York that's surrounded by water and surrounded by lovers from around the world. I can't think of a better person to bring together this multidisciplinary group of speakers. Thank you, Shaul, for your partnership, and you can take it from here.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good night. It's truly wonderful to be here. I really want to thank Anne Ingold for thinking about this panel and bringing together all the new friends and people who are going to explore these very important issues from different angles. This is really a very exciting moment that is made even more exciting by reading the list of water works, ways and rivers and seas that are coming from all the participants. As a Venetian, I've really lived through some very sort of intense moments in the last few months. Suffice it to say that back in November 2019, we experienced the highest aqua alta, the highest flooding in half a century, and we're going to hear more about this shortly. We then, of course, were among the first cities and first countries to enter lockdown, and even had sort of a very alarming incident at a chemical plant in the near town of Marghera. So we've kind of been an encyclopedia of environmental disasters all in a few months. And of course, the trope of death in Venice is a very old and distinguished one. So this is a place where it makes a lot of sense to think about death, but also to think about survival, to think about how to face all the different situations that we're currently experiencing, but also may be ahead of us. I just want to say, to end this introduction, that there is a recent book that I would like to recommend, and if you don't mind, I'll quickly share my screen now. It's a book that by one of the leading Italian cultural historians, Salvatore Settis, and you tell me if you can see that now. Can you see the page with Salvatore Settis? Yes, all right. So Salvatore Settis has a book that in English is called If Venice Died. So it's a very appropriate title for today. He says, because if Venice dies, it won't be the only thing that dies. The very idea of the city as an open space where diversity and social life can unfold, the supreme creation of our civilization as a commitment and promise of democracy will also die with it. And I will say that, this certainly resonates with New York. And the reason why Venice is presented as a paradigmatic city is that, as he points out, all around the world, cities are becoming a lot like each other. And he calls it like the dull global city engulfing the planet. And versus this dull global city, Venice is a thinking machine. A historical city is a thinking machine. And I want to offer this as an idea and a concept for our conversation. It enables us to think about something other than ourselves, and thus helps us learn about ourselves in the process. Now, I think that whether Venice will actually die, or if Venice will find a way, as it has done many times in the past after plagues and disaster, to survive, I have only one certainty, and that is that art is going to play a very important role in it. And so I'm very happy that today we are combining the points of view of scientists and the points of view of artists. And so I'm really happy to introduce the other panelists. And I think the best way to make it really quick is that they can say a few things about the work and themselves, and then we'll have a first round of presentations, and then we will have, I hope, a rich debate, and also I hope we can include our audience in a Q&A session. So thank you very much, and we'll start with from New York. From Craig Blinderman, who is a physician and an academic, and he will introduce the topic from a very particular point of view. And so I invite Craig to be the first speaker in the panel now. Thank you, Craig.
Thanks, Shaul. Thanks. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm going to just put something up for all of us to take a look at. Okay. So my name is Dr. Craig Blinderman. I direct the Adult Palliative Care Service at Columbia University Medical Center. I'm an associate professor there in the Department of Medicine. And I have a range of interests in the humanities and ethics and philosophy, and some bring that to my work and to my thinking and writing. And so, as Andy Engel had remarked at the onset of this conference today, that we were talking in at this very informal gathering, and this is a question that came up for me: is if we can use this analogy or a metaphor, perhaps, as a city, as like a body, and in what ways do cities suffer and potentially even die? And if we take the notion of climate change seriously, to what extent can we imagine similarly our world entering a phase where it becomes uninhabitable and could be thought of as dying, at least relative to a human perspective, or the human interaction with the world is somehow coming to an end. So it's a very morbid thought, but I actually look at this in akin to how we take care of patients who are dying. And in fact, all of us will die. And this is a part of the spirit of reimagine, is how do we reimagine? How do we rethink the ways in which we've formally and habitually looked at life, dying, death, and maybe think about a new framework, a new lens, a new perspective that might give a more richness to our experience of living and dying, and maybe help alleviate some of the challenges that we in society face when approaching this. So I'm going to start with, sort of looking at this from my perspective and then sort of broadening out. I'm not an artist. I'm glad that we have artists here that can comment on the role that this plays. But I'm going to frame it really first and foremost from my vantage point as a palliative care physician, and thinking about how we think about this from an individual patient, and then sort of broaden out a little bit, if you will, permit me, to just sort of set the stage a little bit for how this intersects. It may seem puzzling, why is a palliative care physician, mixed in with these guys here. So just so everyone knows that we have a background and an appreciation for what is palliative care. Some people know what it is, but just to give a simple definition, it's an interdisciplinary caregiving approach aimed at optimizing quality of life and mitigating suffering among people with a serious or complex illness or life-threatening illness. Generally, we think of it as appropriate across the trajectory of disease or illness. As you can see, it might start at the moment of diagnosis or a serious injury, and then continue on over time. And as patients approach the very end of their life, they may be transitioned to a hospice care program, and that would also be sort of under the umbrella of palliative care. But palliative care is not limited to that last phase of one's life, namely when they're in their dying last weeks or months, but actually across the spectrum of the illness experience to help with improving quality of life and reducing or alleviating suffering. When I was in India last year, I was invited to to give a plenary talk at a conference in Cochin. And I was struck by this gray ball that you see that precedes the graph of illness and diagnosis. And I was really thinking about the social, economic, and political forces that lead to disparities in health, illness, and poor quality of life. And we see it in many countries across the world. Certainly, we see it now in the United States with the COVID pandemic, revealing some of the real deep structural problems and vulnerabilities of our system and the disparities that exist. So if we were to name these elements, they would be things like social inequities, poverty, homelessness, war, food scarcity, climate change, pollution, corruption. And so if you take this wider lens, where you're not just simply looking at an individual patient, but maybe taking a public health minded approach and saying, well, how do we palliate all of these issues? Because some of them are intractable problems that don't have an easy solution or cure, and may persist over time in different forms, in different ways. And while we may be chipping away at some of the root causes of it, we may not be able to eradicate it the way you might eradicate a bad pneumonia with an antibiotic. And so how do we palliate these issues that facing humans individually and collectively? So it really requires us to take this broader view when it comes to public health and sort of the way our societies are structured. If we permit this to go a little bit further, seeing the city as a body, or taking this public health minded view and adopting it to our world or our living environment in a city, we can ask similar questions. You know, we've heard about this early on in the ancient world. The Plato divided up the soul and made it analogous to components of the city, right? You had this irrational component, was like the ruling class. The spirit was like the soldiers, the guardians of the city, and the appetitive or the animalistic instincts that we have is like akin to the workers of the city. And so he drew this kind of distinction. So it goes back, millennia, right? This is not a new idea that the city may be analogous to a body. There's indeed some illustrations. This I found not too long ago from the 15th century, also Italian, so I'm glad we got a little bit more Italian representation here, but also a Chinese schematic map of the city as well. And you can see the references below. So clearly there are some ideas that the city can be akin to a body, at least on some level, and we're going to push that. This is just a visual depiction. You can see there is you can see the subway system of Manhattan almost like legs and arms or tentacles. There's some kind of like a living being that's circulating, or you can see it as a circulatory pattern, like the arteries and veins of our body, the sinews of our muscles. But in any case, there seems to be in our mind, and we anthropomorphize things often, and it may make us appreciate and understand the spaces that we inhabit. This is again another depiction of the city as a body and bodies as a city. Again, really speaking to the components that make up a body and the components that make up a city, and using that as a kind of analogy to ground us in thinking about well-being, right? What does a well city look like? What does a well body look like? And lastly, I found this image as well, which also lays out some anatomical relationships specifically to Venice. And so these are I just wanted to give folks a visual sort of representation of how I've been thinking about this, and then entering into this conversation. So if we take this notion seriously of the city as a living being or as a body, you can imagine clearly things like the flow of traffic, persons, and commerce could be seen as a kind of blood and lymph systems, as we saw in the subway diagram. Citizens could be seen as cells or individual components of this body. There's growth that happens over time. Cities grow. They change in size and scope, depth, height, etc., similar to our own biological development over time. There's a history. Our bodies contain a history. We have scars. We have injuries, we have past experiences and memories. And similarly, cities bear that as well, bombings from World War II or other atrocities or other challenges and things that have happened that have led to a shared history. There's interconnected spaces and functions of a city, which may be like our organs that have specific and unique functions, or the interstitial space between our tissues that make up our bodies that may also be akin to areas of space in a city. And we're vulnerable. I think we can both recognize the vulnerability that both human bodies have in the world, as well as more and more climate change disasters and other kinds of emergencies or crises that may befall a city, whether it be war or migrant movements of populations and so on. And this is just another visual after Hurricane Sandy. You can see this is a picture of Manhattan. Lower Manhattan is kind of blacked out because of the intense flooding and destruction that happened after Hurricane Sandy, leaving essentially the city darkened, which is the city that never sleeps, seemingly had some days of darkness. And so similar to how I think about human beings and my patients when they're facing an existential threat, namely their own mortality, right? They're diagnosed with a serious or life-threatening illness like a cancer diagnosis, or recently in the setting of a really serious COVID-19 infection, which is likely to take their life. And how do we, as human beings, adapt and shift to this existential threat that becomes no longer something that's far off in the future that we can somehow ignore, but actually becomes like right in our face. As one of my colleagues says, you know, given the diagnosis of a terminal illness is like an existential slap in the face, right? So we all know, I was just reviewing this with our fellows this morning, I was forgetting the term, but there's this notion of middle knowledge where we all know that we have a sense of our mortality, and yet we're also contributing to the world and making plans and so on. So we live in this middle space that we have. But when we are faced with a serious existential threat, it really blows up, and then we have to pivot and think about how do we live our life and how do we think about things. And maybe we should be doing this more earlier in our lives. And this is part of what I think Reimagine helps us to reconsider the ways in which thinking about our mortality, thinking about death and dying may actually allow us to live in more humane, compassionate, and interconnected ways. At least for me, that's been how I've seen things. So we often ask this question, what matters most, right? When facing with a terminal illness where time is limited, you would have to ask this question, what matters most? So if a city is under existential threat, what matters most? What do we care most about living in a city? I live in New York. Some of you are in Venice and other places around the world. So what matters? What do we care about? Maintaining connections. This is something that's obviously come up in this current pandemic, and how do we connect in ways when we can't physically be together? Reducing unnecessary destruction, right? So it breaks our heart when we see monuments that you know, from, let's say, the Taliban had destroyed these ancient Buddhist, you know, sculptures and cities, and it broke our hearts, not because, you know, we had any deep connection with that particular monument, but it's a culture of cultural significance, of our human longing for understanding the universe and for expression, and it embodied in this physical way. So reducing unnecessary destruction, especially of sites of great cultural heritage and meaning in our lives. Preserving legacies, honoring the cultural and artistic institutions. You know, when the Met Opera decided rightfully to stop performing as cases were increasing, it broke my heart. And I think a lot of New Yorkers felt like that was the point where we really did move into a new phase in this world, where you can't go to a cultural institution like the Met, for example, and sit together. And so we recognize how much we value something when it's taken away from us. You know, you don't know what you have until it's gone adage seemingly would be appropriate here to think about the things about cities when they're not accessed. And then there are the practical concerns for the inhabitants of a dying or threatened city. So for me, as a healthcare provider and someone who's interested in the public health, I have to ask these kinds of questions. How do we alleviate suffering? when individuals in the city is suffering something like Hurricane Sandy or another kind of insult from a climate change or other disaster? How do we make sure that we provide care and help and support to the most vulnerable so that they still have access to housing, food, water, and safety in the midst of a situation where those who may have means may be able to leave the city and go to their homes elsewhere or go to some other place and as it were, and not be as affected. And so we have to turn our attention to those who don't have that's not possible to do so. Can we think about new or virtual spaces for connecting when we're threatened in this way? How do we make meaning of our experiences? Normally it's through art, nature, love, stories, our religious or spiritual practices, family, relations. These are all the things that come up when I talk to patients. This is what they tell me is most important to them and what gives their life their meaning, helps them to cope, helps them to live fully. And how do we focus on the quality of life and not at this point on economic prosperity? So much of the decision-making that goes on in city governance and legislative bodies has to deal with the large economic output that cities, especially like New York, would have, and how do we take that into consideration with all the other interests that are at stake? Well, if the city is not going to be moving forward in that way, or they may be compromised in very severe ways, as we've seen recently, where a city can be shut down and effectively the economic prosperity just turned down completely, how do we focus on quality of life? What matters? What do we pay attention to in our world? And lastly, I want to leave us with this image, because I think for me this really speaks to how I see lots of things, but in particular in this conversation. And those of you who are maybe familiar with this Tibetan Buddhist practice of the sand mandalas, where Buddhist monks will spend hours, days, sometimes weeks, putting together these intricately designed mandalas, these creative pieces of great detail and great artistic beauty, and also of spiritual significance as part of their meditative practice to kind of enter into this world as a mandala. And then at a certain point, it's brushed away, it's destroyed, it's temporary, it's impermanent. And so the nature of impermanence, the nature of the uncertainty and the future loss that this beautiful creation will have is for all of us. And there's a way that we can maybe apply this kind of knowledge, this kind of wisdom together. How do we face impermanence together? And I would add, with compassion. And so if we take this notion into a city that is vulnerable or at stake of an existential threat, I would like to leave us with this notion of facing impermanence together and being compassionate to each other, and how we can still nonetheless live well despite the losses that we may be seeing. So I'm going to stop there and turn it back to Shaul.
Thank you very much, Craig. This was a wonderful start, very rich. And now we quickly move to a different city and a different perspective. Caroline Smith is a scholar of architecture and urban design, and she's a research collaborator of a very important organization called We're Here Venice. And so she will talk about the body of Venice, the body of the city. And maybe later I will add a few things about how Venice is represented as specifically a female body. But now let me turn the floor to Caroline. Thank you.
Hi. So this kind of follows on from the theme of the death of Venice. So in my work on Venice, I spent a lot of time trying to understand the identity of the city. And as much as we focus a lot on the physical form, the city is as much kind of constructed from layers of myth and sociocultural practices, and understanding the various inflections that these have taken over time and how these have formed the contemporary identity of the city. And so what we have today is that the death of Venice is the city's most prominent myth. And to a certain extent, it's become something of a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more we talk about the death of Venice, the more we have people rushing to see the city before it inevitably dies. And the more we have kind of a sense of inertia to actually address the city's challenges. So I'm sharing my screen. Can you see it? Does that work? Okay. So this kind of the death of Venice myth is something that actually began with when we had the fall of the Republic. Before then, the Republic was slowly losing its economic power, and gradually, from an incredibly powerful empire, it became something seen as dying or losing its impotence. And this myth very much coalesced in 1966 when we had the record-breaking Acqua Alta, which is the highest that the water has ever come. Acqua Alta is when the city floods due to tidal and storm pressures. So at this, the water reached nearly 2 meters above mean tide level. And we also, oops, if I can do this, we had a similar event last year in November when this was the second highest instance of Acqua Alta in recorded history. These moments are kind of when the lagoon and Venice first started to be seen as the lagoon and the city pitted against each other as mortal enemies. Up until this point, they were seen as one cohesive whole. And actually, they used to worry more about the lagoon silting up than the flooding caused by it. But this all feeds into this general narrative of the fragility of the city. But I choose to see this more as a rebirth rather than a potential death of the city, because at this point, Venice became the symbolic canary in the coal mine for a lot of postmodern problems that we see today. And it gave it a relevance in contemporary culture beyond just a place of nostalgia. And so we see this with also the urban form of the city. We talk about the death of the city. Well, to be dead, to die, you must be therefore alive. And so when we compare the form of the city, it's a city built completely at a human scale. It's almost unique around the world in its density and in the way that it's been constructed. And if we compare this to the image on the right, is the mainland part of the city, a separate city, but on the terraferma, which is a city constructed around the car. And so this is kind of when Shaw's talking about Venice as the postmodern paradigm, is this idea that most of our cities are constructed around the car, and Venice is one of the few that is actually entirely human and built at a human scale. And it kind of speaks of the humanity of the city versus other cities which have been built according to Corbusier's machine for living. We don't worry about machines dying. And so when we talk about the city, we think of it as a living organism, as sort of quoted by Plutarch. And this map I'm showing now is from around 1500. This is the first time that the city was seen as a cohesive whole, and it was actually incredibly influential. This is a 4-meter long woodcut that was made from surveys, hot air balloon surveys of the city. It's incredible, and you can actually lay it over the Google kind of view of the city, and it's incredibly accurate. But this is the first time that we started to become almost fixated with the form of the city and the preservation. And so what's happened is, where we've become more fixated on the existing city, it's not been allowed to change and to adapt to its population who actually inhabit it. And so if a city and its citizens are two parts of the same whole, the city is no longer reflecting the citizens. So we have, in the last 70 years, lost both 2/3 of the resident population and 2/3 of the salt marsh habitats of the lagoon. This is just a map of the city. And so my early work at sort of university at Cambridge was looking at the kind of the form of the city, but since then working for We Are Here Venice is very much trying to situate the city within the ecosystem of the lagoon. Venice is one of the few cities in the world that is entirely permeated by like nature in the tide, whereas most cities are completely divorced from the natural realm. It makes it very easy to forget about it, whereas it's not possible in Venice. And so what we have today is where the form of the city is being preserved for tourism, for this global appetite for the city. And on the left, we kind of have a graphic showing the remaining resident population as compared to the visitor numbers who are coming to the city. And so it's become a bit of, they call it the tourist dictatorship, where instead of the city serving those who supposedly live here, instead it's being preserved for visitors, and it's no longer fit for purpose, which is why we have the problems that we have today. This is a map of the lagoon which shows the municipality of Venice. And I hope that you can see here, there's actually only 3 inlets into the lagoon. And so even when we talk about global sea level rise, is a very pressing concern for the city. It's going to be felt in Venice as much as in many places around the world. But because of the unique form of the city, I actually am quite hopeful, because there's only 3 inlets into the lagoon. And so it means that if properly managed, Venice stands a lot better chance of surviving climate change and sea level rise than the huge swathes of most Miami and Osaka that will be underwater in 100 years. So hey, there's a nice picture of the lagoon with Venice. I feel like yeah, that was what I was going to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
With my internet.
Okay, all right, okay. Thank you very much, Caroline, for this very informative presentation. I simply want to interject at this point that, whenever we talk about Venice and the problems affecting Venice and over tourism, we typically talk about residents and tourists. But I emphatically want to say that people like yourselves and Andy Arnovitz, who will speak later, are in a way neither full-time residents nor tourists, but in fact you make, as scholars and artists, a very important contribution to the city and to its potential survival. Now I would like to invite our next speaker, and so that we start hearing the artist perspective. And so I'm very happy to invite Clarinda McClough, who will be speaking from New York, from the artist perspective, and how art and water, speak to each other. Clarinda, thank you for being with us.
Unmute. Hi everybody. So part of what we did yesterday was just talk about what we do, and we found that it was really productive in a way to hear these 2 perspectives first, because I immediately had a lot of reactions to that. So I'm an artist who also likes to organize organizations, and so I am part of a group of artists so I've made a couple of organizations, and a couple of us, or I'd say 6 to 7 of us really, have made an organization in New York City, based in New York City, called Works on Water, and that supports artists who work on, in, and with waterways, and that's actually a very complex proposition. Here's our website. I just thought I'd show you a sense of how we operate, what we're thinking about, and also, for example, this is our current project, and it's called Walking the Edge. And I feel like, considering what Carolyn was talking about, thinking about Venice and New York and the relationship, it says, New York City is defined by its waterways, but New Yorkers may see our city as more land than water, which I think is an interesting difference in a way, because I feel like in Venice, there's a sense of the water is always present. And I think there's many things that we share, Venice and New York. And also, I was saying yesterday, I have a background. I also do medical writing because you got to do something. And so I have worked in palliative care because I fell into it through my work in HIV, and then I started working in pain management. And so it was really interesting to hear Craig talk about the idea. I often think of the city as a body, but thinking about palliating, the idea of addressing the problems of a city through thinking about how we palliate, how we care for our body, the city, our body. And I think this focus on thinking about death, because cities keep dying. I grew up in a dying city, New York, in the 1970s, and then somehow it came alive again. And now everybody's thinking, oh, it may die again. So we are always dying and being reborn. And I I also created a piece called Salvage Salvation, where I thought that our relationship to climate is very much related to our fear of death. So why are we so afraid of death and decay, of the fact that things must go through a cycle, like the corporate capitalism and the way we approach consumption has a direct effect and is directly related to how we think about death and dying, and also think about palliative care, because if you don't want to think about people dying, you don't want to think about how to help them die well. So to bring it back around to the water, so part of what I do as an artist is I think about how we exist in the future in relationship to climate change, and that existential threat, and thinking about how do we absorb the enormity of that existential threat. So something I do with a partner, with a collaborator, Carolyn Hall, is create these tours of the future, and we call them sunk shore. And we go to a specific shoreline, so far only in New York City, and we take people on a physical walk along that shoreline, and say, not this will happen, but this is now happening to you. And I'm going to just quickly share the screen again. And I was thinking also about the idea of art making meaning, but art is also a form of research and problem solving. So here is, this is a kind of a graphic novel I made of one of our tours to give a sense of like how it goes. So we meet people, we take them through the past, because if you live on a waterway, and then, well, probably anywhere, the past will take you into the future. So for example, Craig was talking about Sandy. So the Sandy, when Sandy flooded, it flooded to the shoreline of 1619, which was basically just before when European settlers started building up the city as it is today. So first we take people into the past, and then we take them into the future, and we say, okay, you're in 2050, we are now in a canal, so we're in boats, and we use these funny little props. We don't want it to be like absolutely determined what you will do, because we want people to imagine, to feel. So I come from dance, and so does my marine biologist collaborator, and so we do think about soma a lot. So we think about the somatic response to data and to thinking about our relationship to water. So here we are in boats. This is along Governor's Island, and we're in 2050, and this is now a canal because of sea level rise. And we also have these way doors, which are wet adaptive dryness sensors. So thinking through all the different possibilities based in the data of climate change, based in the place itself. So New York and Venice, I think it's really interesting because we have these same relationships to land and to the idea of a human scale. And so the cities lend themselves to the idea of bodies. So the fact that we've dredged our waterways so that they are faster, there's more flooding, we have gotten rid of all our marshlands, that changes our relationship to how sea level affects us. These are all congruents. And also the fact that it's one of the few cities in the US that has accreted layers of history, and that is walkable, that you can live in it as a human body. So here, we're also preparing people to be fish bodies. So we're training them to see as fish, which means from side to side, because we may need to become aquatic in the future. and I just wanted to, my last image is just, I wanted to show this drawing that I made because I was responding to interviews I made with people who came to a house that we have on Governor's Island, which I'll say more about in a minute. And I asked them, what do you see in the future? And then I made a series of drawings. And then one person said, the world ends in a series of small steps, not in a big bang. And I feel like this idea of thinking about adaptation is essential, and thinking about how we create our new reality in relationship to the idea of death or existential threat. We are not just, we're not just dying. Oh, and Carolyn is affiliated with that. Who knew? Okay, I'm not good at putting things in chat while I'm talking, by the way, but there's a lot to say. So Works on Water, I just wanted to say, like, we have a house that's a residency that's on Governor's Island, which is a small island in New York Harbor that has a long and interesting history. But it's a way for us to gather community around the idea that artists working with water is essential in the way that Craig talks about making meaning. It's essential also for thinking about how we create this adaptation, how we shift our thinking in relationship to the existential threat of climate change and the way that the city exists. I think that's enough for now.
Wonderful, Clarinda. Thank you so much. Let me say that I look forward to welcome you in Venice. Maybe we should, think about a project. We have a long tradition of leading a kind of amphibian life, and so I think you can really sort of have meaningful ideas for that. And since we're talking about living with water, we can now talk about living underwater. And I'm happy to turn to another artist, Andy Arnovitz, that I had the great pleasure of working with on more than one project. And she will explain everything about our collaboration with Venetian. Let me just mention that we're also joined among the participants by Lina Vadenka and Ken Goldman, who are two of the artists involved in the project that Andy is going to talk with. So Andy from Jerusalem, thank you so much.
So thank you all. It's very interesting to hear this discussion because living in Jerusalem, we have a big water issue, but it's the exact opposite issue, which is we don't have enough water. And we're working very hard because we're not going to have enough water. So water is a fundamental theme, but our way we deal with it here is slightly different. So I guess in 2018, Shaul came to me and said, Bet Venezia wants to do something about examining climate change through a Jewish lens. And he came up with this great idea based on a joke, actually, of what Judaism has to contribute to the conversation of climate change and how we could look at climate change through a uniquely Jewish lens. And you actually don't have to go very far before you realize that Judaism has all kinds of things to say. And I would like to say that my first reaction in hearing the discussion about morbid cities and palliative care is that the 5 artists in examining this problem and in living in Venice and walking through the streets and learning about all the issues of a city in an existential crisis, so to speak, was that we felt like we needed, as artists, to examine the issue of hope and also adaptation. And so I'm just going to start by showing you some interesting things. So we began by walking and learning all about Venice and being everywhere. And I just would like to draw your attention, to the chimneys, the chimney pots, because it's something that you could easily overlook when you're walking the streets of Venice. You tend to be looking down and you tend to be looking at the water. But the roof line in Venice is extremely unique. And one of the things I noticed was that these massive chimneys that are no longer used. And part of our artistic process while we were in Venice was thinking of how as human beings we're going to need to adapt to these new realities. And this is just a page. All the artists were required to have sketchbooks. This was a page from a sketchbook about, well, what would happen if trees were planted in every one of those chimney pots? What would happen then? So we began an artistic journey. This is one of the artists, Medad, working on his etchings. We had the great privilege to work in the Scuola di Grafica in Cannaregio, which is, for anyone that is works with printmaking, this is one of those dreamy, historic, gorgeous, state-of-the-art kinds of places. So we created a suite of etchings. We created a suite of 10 etchings that all dealt with Venice, water, and climate change. This is a close-up of one of my simple etchings where we have trees growing out of the chimney pots. And then the artists were also required, basically this whole idea blew up. We started with a very simple idea of just working in tandem with the Scuola di Grafica and doing etchings. But we very quickly realized that this topic and the privilege of being artists and examining this topic through our eyes was endless. So each of the artists created snow globes, which in and of themselves are these kind of miniature worlds, these individual tiny miniature worlds. So this was the one I did. This is the one that Lynn did, and she's part of the Zoom group here. A beautiful bubble that she did, snow globe. This is one that Kenny did, which is entirely focused on the lagoon and water and the lions of Venice. And after we did these, we created a zine. We created a 64-page zine that was filled with articles, art, poetry, photography, that examined the issues of climate change and Venice through a Jewish lens with scholars from all over the world. This is, on the left is a piece of art that Lynn did, on the right is a watercolor that Medad did. And we found that we had this incredible archive of works. We also did a poster, and on one side you see excerpts from all of our sketchbooks. Everybody was required to keep an artistic journal. This entire thing morphed into an exhibition that was presented at the Jerusalem Biennale of 2019. And there you can see the snow globes and the suite of etchings and the zines on the wall that people could take down and look through. Lucia Veronese did a fantastic video that in the beginning, as with this entire project, in the beginning, she was tasked with documenting our process. But very quickly, that became a work of art in its own right. This is, we ended up with a studio wall. There was so much work that was created during this process that was not required, but we just kept going. So we had this amazing studio wall with sculptures and etchings and interventions. One of the artists, Leora Weiss, is also a puppeteer. And she created an entire interactive puppet show based on Jonah and the whale. And afterwards, there was a workshop for children. And all of these things dealt with climate change, dealt with water, dealt with Venice. So we just kind of kept going. And I really would just sort of like to leave this presentation with one last piece of art, because I think that rather than thinking, this is just me personally speaking, rather than thinking of palliating the death of a city, I would like to suggest that as artists and through art, we can heal a city. We can present ways of adapting, and I actually think Corona has been a huge lesson in adaptation, because we have very, very quickly had to learn how to adapt, change our lives, work from home, not travel, be in touch with people through Zoom and a million other things. And this has happened in like just a few short months. So we can adapt, I think, when push comes to shove. And I would just like to sort of leave all of us with this idea that as artists, we continue to search for new ways of educating, of exploring, of asking, and also of repairing. I think that that's what art and artists do best. And I think that's how we can contribute to the conversation and how we can literally reimagine another reality, how we can create solutions and new paradigms in ways of looking at climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy. Thank you. Thank you. So I said at the beginning, as a Venetian, that wherever the city goes, I'm not only confident, but convinced that art should play a role in the future. I should have clarified, and of course I took it for granted, but I think I should spell it out, that for me, the kind of artistic interventions that Andy and Clarinda has beautifully shared with us really show how art needs to be in conversation with science. And in fact, what this panel wants to demonstrate and embody is really that conversation between the scientist, the social scientist, the hard scientist, and the artist can really provide different answers to our condition. And if you allow me to do a little bit of sort of to share a sort of a self-serving message, thanks to the experience of living underwater as an academic, I've been inspired to try to create what is going to be the first Italian master's degree in environmental humanities, which is an academic degree entirely offered in English. That will put in the same program the biologists, the chemists, the geographers, with the philosophers, the historians, the environmental historians, the literature people. So we really want to try to say, well, you know, Venice is in jeopardy. Venice is really facing an existential threat, but you know, we should respond to it in a truly sort of multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary perspective. And so I will simply put the link, in case you're interested, in the chat. And now I would really like to include other people in the conversation. I know that our speakers have a lot to say. I have other questions for them, but maybe we should already invite people if they want to ask a question, make quick comments, and our speakers could respond to them. So I don't know if there's anyone. Yeah, just raise your hand and I will call on you. And otherwise, maybe I can also ask the speakers if they want to respond to each other. And maybe if while people just think about their questions, can I go back to Craig and ask something that was partly raised by Clarinda, and that's about how we try to face the fact that when we face death, we can be simply paralyzed, and we can be, and the same when we facing the prospect of even the environmental disaster. When we talk to people, say, Venice may not be there, or we may be completely submerged in 50 years. The immediate reaction, it could really be a way of saying, oh yes, we rationally know that, but then we are completely paralyzed and we just try to move on. From your point of view, what is the first step to try to really avoid being totally paralyzed?
Right. So that speaks to maybe how we cope, some of the coping strategies that we employ in our lives, and some coping strategies are better than others. Clinically, what we often do is we meet patients and their families where they're at and identify what are the coping strategies that they may be employing in the given moment that they're finding themselves in. So it might be, as you said, a reaction of a kind of being paralyzed, which may correlate with a coping of, I don't want to use the word denial, but sort of ignoring or distracting yourself from the concerns at hand. And that's certainly one of many coping strategies that can be offered or that can be used when you're facing a serious illness or facing a real challenge in one's life. And so I think what we tend to do, or what I like to think about, is how do we increase the imagination of individuals to use other coping strategies, to find other ways that maybe are either unfamiliar or maybe have had some exposure to, but haven't really dove into it. Take meditation, for example, which that's something that is dear to me. For many people, that's not something that they've used as an anchor in their life when they're going through difficult circumstances. So I might offer an opportunity to do that, or a sublimation, right? Where you find maybe you're particularly angry about something, and you have many options what you can do with that anger. You can do something that's potentially harmful, or you can use that energy and channel it in a different way. Maybe go for a run, or take a boxing class, or something where that energy can be utilized in a way maybe that's more positive and healthier for your body or healthier for your community. So one way is just really meeting people where they're at and knowing that everyone's experience with facing an existential threat is not going to be uniform. There's a kind of a plurality of responses that human beings have, and it goes from the very unhealthy and harmful ways of coping to very healthy and or healthier ways of coping. So I think that there would be one place I would look at, and then I would, sometimes we have to break things down a little bit, and know that it's too big to face something as painful and as distressing as the loss of your life or a loved one or the city that you've been inhabiting. And so you might not necessarily take that whole piece all in front of you and try to engage with it if it's too overwhelming, but maybe take a small component of that. If things were to worsen, what sort of plans could you make today to take care of something that's really important to you, like making sure that your children are well cared for if you're gone. So people often will do last wills and testaments, right, to make sure that their finances, their assets, if they have any, would go towards people that are in their lives or whatever. So there might be some practical things that you can maybe turn the attention towards that might be easier, manageable, rather than taking on the entire existential distress of losing your life or your city's life.
Thank you, Craig. If I may interject a quick comment, as a Venetian, as a Venetian Jew, and as an English literature professor, sometimes I feel I belong to three categories that may not be around for much longer, and so I really need to increase and expand my imagination. But I think there's something very interesting that connects, of course, Carolyn's presentation and Andy's, and I would like to invite Carolyn to say something more about what the organization that she belongs to, We Are Here Venice, does to prevent the death of the city, or at least to help all the people that are concerned with the city to understand what's going on. So Carolyn, will you say a little bit about the organization, and that is led by this wonderful activist, Jane Damosto, who is really an important figure in the city.
So essentially this feeds really well into what we were hearing earlier about how art really has a role to play in kind of developing this vision for the future. We work in a completely interdisciplinary way on our team. I come from an architecture background, but we have scientists, we have artists, we have activists. And what we quite strongly feel is that science can tell us maybe how, but it can't tell us why or necessarily what needs to be done. And so only by working with such diverse groups that represent all of the stakeholders of the city are we going to get imaginative responses. There's been so much, it's in the papers, it's all over the world. Everyone knows about Venice's problems. So part of what we do is provide reliable fixed points of information to push the debate forward. But actually through working with artists and activists, local businesses, is trying to develop, okay, so what can we do? And we work in a very solution-focused approach that's quite speculative in some ways, to mean that yes, we can outline these huge problems, but actually what are the positive, direct actions that we can put into play on the ground to actually start to make meaningful change? And sometimes these are quite small and sometimes they're quite big. So I'll reference quickly what you said earlier about visitors in Venice. Like we don't think that there should be no tourists in Venice at all. That's completely not what I meant to say. Like Venice has always supported high levels of residential mobility. But there's certain forms of tourism which are far more destructive, either socially, environmentally, or economically, than their kind of gain back to the city. And so this is why addressing the cruise ships in Venice is such a key part of what we do, because the environmental degradation that's caused by the deep dredging needed for the ships is a huge part of why we have extreme weather events like what we experienced last November. Essentially, to make the lagoon most of the lagoon is less than a meter deep, and to make the lagoon able to support these massive ships, we're dredging up to 12 meter channels. And so this is creating it's like the bayification, which isn't a very nice word, but essentially instead of a lagoon ecosystem, it's becoming a sea bay. And so part of what we're doing is trying to help to restore the salt marsh habitats within the lagoon, which will make not only habitats for birds and the other life that used to live here, but also make the city more resilient against weather. Sorry, is this really, can you hear all the noise from outside? Sorry. Wait for it to pass. But also to make the city more resilient against future weather events, because it will, I've lost my train of thought. So the Acqua Alta last year was not just where we had the high tide and lots of water coming down from the mountains, but also where there are these huge expanses of water, where the wind is able to generate enough of a current that then pushed the water back into the lagoon, and that's why we had such devastating effects.
Thank you, Caroline. We have a few minutes left, and I would like to use them to ask both Clarinda and Andy to tell us a little bit about their current projects and perhaps developments of living underwater. Clarinda, would you please?
Sorry, unmute. So the work with what works on water is a kind of quite wide ranging. And so 2020 was to have been our second triennial, which is to say our first triennial, because we had our first triennial in 2017, and that's only an exhibition until you have the second one. So the form of that has changed a lot, but that means that we engage artists, water artists, in as many ways as possible. And because of the shift around COVID-19, the coronavirus, we have been shifting and changing our programming, obviously, quite a bit. But we had this idea for Walking the Edge, which was we were going to walk all 520 miles of New York City coastline in a continuous relay for 24 hours a day until it was all walk. So yes, there are 520 miles of New York City coastline, FYI. So, and that is part of this idea of like, we are a city of water, and bringing people to the waterfront. It's in collaboration with the New York City Department of Planning and their waterfront open spaces team, who is an amazing group of people. And I just want to say the people who are Works on Water are Nancy Noachek, Sarah Cameron Cindy, Eve Mosher, Carolyn Hall, me, Emily Blumenfeld, and Stowe Len. And then we have a lot of people in the community that we've created. And all of these people were going to be involved with this project, but because you couldn't actually go outside when we wanted to start it in May 20th, May 2020, we actually shifted it to give space to artists to populate our Instagram account with their own idea and thinking about how we live at the edge in relationship to water's edges all the time. And then there will be other events throughout the summer, so please keep your eyes on that. And that's like And I think that it's important to mention that this is all in this very intense climate of addressing inequity and thinking about, like, because climate justice is directly related to racial justice and health justice, as Craig was bringing up earlier. Like, there is no addressing one without the other. So the fact that in the US and then also elsewhere now, the movement for Black lives is so strong and so robust is directly related to the fact that all these inequities have become, through disease, very obvious, but they have already been there through how climate impacts people. And I think that's just something to think about when we think about death. Like, how does death affect the bodies of the humans and the other creatures, as well as the city as an entity?
Thank you very much, Clarinda. And now I'll ask Andy the same. I just want to mention that we're also joined by members of the Scuola Internazionale di Grafica, where the Living Underwater project took place. So hi, Deirdre. Andy, what are you working on at present?
So there's me personally, what I'm working on, which is something that I started almost a year ago, which is dealing with disease and epidemiology. And that's kind of morphed into riffs on corona, like what does a sneeze look like? What does a cough look like? Are these things are beautiful and horrible at the same time? That's sort of me personally, but I would like to say that the 5 artists were so committed and we became such a cohesive group that none of us really were willing to just sort of end the project. We played with a lot of ideas of becoming like a collaboration or a collective. I think Corona hurt us in terms of momentum. I'm still trying very hard, and I think that Clarinda probably can agree. This is a very bad time to make proposals to museums and to art galleries. I mean, I would love to see Living Underwater travel. I think it's particularly effective and pointed towards a North American audience. It's ready to go, but Corona has kind of put the big kibosh on sending out proposals and getting museums and galleries interested. But that's something that I would like to keep alive and keep working. And I think that the 5 artists, we still are sort of trying to figure out a way to keep producing things. We sort of made a pledge to each other that every month we were going to take an article or some event, some world event, and do riffs on it, small scale, small works on paper. And if we all did that one a month, we would end up with 64 new pieces of art to add to the exhibition, or maybe to one day make a coffee table book, something like that. So I have to say we lost a little bit of momentum during COVID, but I'm really hoping that we get back to it.
All right, so thank you so much. We have run out of time in the best possible way with such a rich conversation. I just want to mention that if you're interested in learning more about Venice art and climate change, our university is offering a series of online conversations and I put the link on the chat earlier, called Environmental Humanities, A View from Venice, where different scientists, artists, scholars will talk to each other. And that will also include 2 filmmakers that are with us today, Ted Harding and Elizabeth Kaufman, who have been doing a lot of work. Also, we are here, Venice, and they're been working on a project called Venice is Thinking. And I would like to thank you all and to leave you with one image that means a lot to me and to many other Venetians. And if you allow me to do that very quickly, this is, can you see that? In these days, as you know, statues, monuments, and sculptures are very much in the news for their political significance. And this is the most, I think, special monument we have in Venice, is called the Monument to the Dead Partisan Woman. and it celebrates the contribution of women to the anti-fascist resistance, wars of resistance at the end of the war. And its unique feature is that it's not classically standing erect in the middle of a square, but it's actually on water, laid on water. And when we had that horrible flooding back in November 2019, it was completely submerged. And I saw pictures and I thought it may have been, washed away and we had lost her. And some people just instinctively walked there the next day to see if it was still there. And it was still there. Simply the water had risen so high that he had covered the woman, but the woman was still there. And the woman, of course, represents resistance. And it also represents the power of art to remind us of how fragile and vulnerable we are, as Craig was reminding us so eloquently at the beginning, and how we still to see ourselves. And I'm thinking of, Clarinda's wonderful walking practice, to see us always on the edge, always in danger, but also thinking of how many ways of resisting, reacting, and responding to that. So thank you so much to all the speakers. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to Reimagine for hosting us. And I hope that our path can cross again soon and in person. So have a wonderful rest of the day, evening. Thank you, Craig Blinderman. Thank you, Caroline Smith. Thank you, Clarinda McLeod. Thank you, Andy Arnovitz. And thank you, Andrew Ingle, for hosting us. Bye.
Bravi a tutti.
Take care, everybody. Thank you.